You've probably heard this before. Just wait until 70. It sounds simple, clean, responsible. But what if that advice is quietly wrong for a lot of people? Not always wrong, just incomplete. Because the decision about when to take Social Security isn't a rule, it's a moving target shaped by uncertainty, trade-offs, and timing you don't control. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Millions of people lock themselves into a decision without ever understanding what they're actually optimizing for. Some claim early at 62 and regret it. Others wait too long and never fully benefit. So which one is the mistake? That's where things get interesting. Think of your Social Security like a valve connected to a tank that's been filling your entire working life. Every paycheck added pressure. Every year you delayed turning that valve, the pressure built higher. Hi, my name is Bryony, and I spend way much time thinking about why people who look financially reckless are sometimes better prepared for disaster than people who did everything right. If you've ever felt vaguely unsettled about how dependent your entire financial life is on one company, subscribe and hit the... At 70, that pressure is at its peak. Open it then, and the flow is strong, steady, and maximized. But here's the catch no one emphasizes enough. You don't get rewarded for pressure you never use. If you wait too long and don't live long enough to enjoy it, that stored value doesn't get refunded. It simply never becomes real. So the real question isn't how big can the monthly payment be, it's when does turning this on give me the most real-world value over my lifetime? To make this easier, let's walk through a simple example. Imagine someone who spent decades earning a solid income, not ultra-wealthy, not struggling, just consistent middle to upper range earnings. At 62, they can start receiving a reduced monthly benefit. If they wait until their full retirement age, that number increases delay all the way to 70, and the monthly payment jumps significantly higher. This creates a classic trade-off. Start early and receive smaller payments over more years, or wait and receive larger payments over fewer years. At first glance, it feels like a straightforward math problem. Add everything up, compare totals, pick the bigger number. But that logic depends on one assumption that completely breaks the model. You don't know how long you're going to live. Most people underestimate how much that single unknown changes everything. If you assume a longer lifespan, delaying looks better. If you assume a shorter one, claiming early suddenly becomes more attractive. And the shift doesn't require extreme changes. A difference of just a few years can flip the optimal decision entirely. That's what makes this so tricky. You're not solving for a fixed outcome. You're making a decision under uncertainty. Now layer in something else that often gets ignored: inflation adjustments. Social Security isn't static. Benefits increase over time to keep up with rising costs, but those increases aren't equal across all scenarios. A higher starting benefit means larger increases in absolute terms. So someone who delays doesn't just get a bigger initial payment, they also get larger future adjustments. Over decades, that compounds into a meaningful gap. What looks like a modest difference early on can turn into a substantial advantage later. So now you're juggling multiple moving pieces: uncertain lifespan, changing inflation, different starting points, compounding adjustments, and that's before even considering your personal situation. Because once you introduce real life into the equation, things get far more nuanced. There are situations where claiming early isn't just reasonable, it's strategically sound, and not for emotional reasons, but logical ones. Let's start with something straightforward. Health changes everything. If your medical history or family pattern suggests a shorter lifespan, the entire framework shifts.
Delaying benefits only pays off if you're around long enough to collect them. If that window shrinks, the advantage of waiting shrinks with it. In that case, starting earlier ensures you actually receive more of what you've earned over time. It's not pessimistic thinking. It's adjusting the model to match reality. Then there's something people rarely say out loud. Not all years of retirement are equal. There's a phase early on where energy is higher, mobility is better, and experiences are more accessible. Travel, hobbies, social activities, this is when people tend to spend more and live more actively. Later years often look very different. Spending drops, activity narrows, priorities shift toward comfort and care. So the same dollar doesn't carry the same value across time. Money available earlier can enable experiences that simply aren't possible later. That's not emotional reasoning. That's understanding how utility changes over time. Now let's introduce another layer: coordination between partners. For couples, this decision is never just about one person. There are interactions between benefits that can dramatically alter the outcome. In some cases, one partner's decision directly unlocks income opportunities for the other. If one person delays too long, it can unintentionally delay benefits the household could have been receiving. That's income left unused, not because it didn't exist, but because the timing wasn't aligned. And then there are more complex scenarios. Imagine one partner has a significantly higher benefit and also faces serious health concerns. That changes the strategy entirely. Instead of focusing on maximizing one benefit in isolation, the goal becomes optimizing what the household receives across both lifetimes. In some cases, starting earlier allows one stream of income to begin while preserving access to a larger benefit later. It's not about choosing early or late, it's about sequencing. Now let's shift away from personal factors and look at something external: the market. Most people don't think about Social Security as a tool for managing investment risk, but it absolutely can be. Imagine entering retirement during a major market downturn. Your portfolio drops sharply. At the same time, you still need to cover living expenses. If you're forced to sell investments at depressed prices, you lock in losses that can permanently damage your long-term outlook. But if you have another income source, you gain flexibility. You can reduce or even pause withdrawals from your portfolio. That gives your investments time to recover instead of forcing bad timing decisions. In that context, starting benefits earlier isn't a loss, it's a form of protection, a stabilizer. There's even an opposite version of this idea. If markets are down and you're not yet withdrawing heavily, having guaranteed income allows you to avoid selling assets or even invest at lower prices. You're effectively using stable income to take advantage of volatility. That's not reckless, that's strategic positioning. Now let's talk about taxes, which quietly shape a lot of these decisions. The way Social Security is taxed depends on your overall income. In certain periods, especially early retirement years, your income might be relatively low. That creates a window where benefits could be taxed lightly or not at all. Later, required withdrawals from retirement accounts can push your income higher, increasing your tax exposure. So, the timing of when you start benefits can influence how much of that income you actually keep. In some cases, starting earlier allows you to take advantage of lower tax years before additional income sources kick in. And then there's the simplest reason of all. Sometimes you just need the money. Plans don't always unfold the way we expect. Unexpected expenses, family responsibilities, changes in income. These things happen. Social Security exists as a foundation. Using it when needed isn't a failure of planning. It's the system working as intended. At this point, you might be wondering, so what's the right answer? Start early or wait? That's the wrong question. The better question is, which factors actually apply to your situation right now? Because this decision isn't about following a rule. It's about understanding trade-offs and making a choice that fits your reality.
Let's take this out of theory and put it into something more concrete. Because once real numbers enter the picture, everything starts to feel less abstract and a lot more uncomfortable. Imagine someone standing at the edge of retirement, trying to make this decision. They've worked for decades, paid into the system consistently, and now they're looking at 3 different paths: start early, start at the standard age, or delay for the maximum benefit. Each option comes with a different monthly payment: lower now, higher later. At first, most people try to solve this the same way. They add everything up. If I start here, I get this much over time. If I wait, I get that much instead. Then they compare totals and look for the larger number. That approach feels logical, it feels responsible, but it hides something critical. Those totals are built on assumptions that are fragile. Change one input slightly, and the entire outcome shifts. Let's say you assume a longer lifespan. Waiting looks like the obvious winner, but shorten that assumption, even by a few years, and suddenly the early option starts catching up. Push it a bit further, and early becomes the better choice. This isn't a gradual shift, it's a flip, and that's what makes people uncomfortable, because it means the optimal strategy isn't stable. It depends heavily on something you cannot predict with certainty. Now here's where most simplified explanations fall apart. They treat this like a single variable equation: start early versus start late. That's it. But in reality, this decision behaves more like a system, multiple forces interacting at the same time. Let's unpack a few of those forces. First, timing. When you start doesn't just affect how much you receive, it affects when that money becomes usable. And that matters more than people think. Money today has flexibility. It can be spent, invested, or used to reduce pressure elsewhere. Money later is larger, but delayed, and delay has a cost. Think about it this way. If you receive income earlier, you might reduce withdrawals from your investments. That allows your portfolio to stay invested longer. Or you might use that income to avoid taking on debt, or to cover expenses without liquidating assets at the wrong time. So even though the monthly payment is smaller, its impact can ripple outward in ways that don't show up in simple totals. Now consider something else: sequence. Not just how much you get, but in what order you receive it. Receiving smaller amounts earlier and larger amounts later creates a very different financial trajectory than the reverse. And depending on your situation, one sequence may align better with your needs. For example, if your early retirement years are more active and expensive, having income during that phase can be more valuable than having extra income decades later. On the other hand, if your goal is to maximize stability in later life, delaying may better support that. This isn't about right or wrong, it's about alignment. Now let's zoom in on a mistake that quietly distorts a lot of decisions. People assume consistency. They assume their spending, health, and priorities will remain relatively stable over time. But that's not how life works. Spending patterns tend to follow a curve: higher in the early years, moderate in the middle, and lower later on. Health follows a similar pattern: more capability early, more limitations later. So when you model everything as flat and consistent, you miss the reality that different periods of life carry different weights. $1 at 63 and $1 at 83 are not interchangeable in terms of what they can do for you. Now let's introduce another layer: uncertainty stacking. It's not just lifespan that's uncertain. Market returns are uncertain. Inflation is uncertain. Policy changes are uncertain. Personal circumstances are uncertain. Each one adds variability, and when combined, they create a wide range of possible outcomes. This is why two people with nearly identical financial profiles can reasonably make completely different decisions. They're not solving the same problem. They're prioritizing different risks. One person might prioritize maximizing total lifetime income. Another might prioritize reducing exposure to market downturns. Another might prioritize having more usable income earlier. All three can be rational. Now let's talk about something subtle but powerful: optionality. Starting earlier gives you something that waiting does not: flexibility. Once you delay, you're committing to that delay. You're giving up access to income during that period. But once you start, that income begins flowing, and it can support multiple strategies. It can act as a buffer. It can reduce dependence on other assets. It can provide psychological comfort, which, whether people admit it or not, affects decision-making. And that psychological factor matters, because financial decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're made by humans who react to stress, humans who make different choices under pressure. Having a stable, predictable income stream can reduce the likelihood of making reactive decisions during uncertain times. Now flip that perspective. Delaying offers a different kind of advantage. It increases certainty later. A higher guaranteed payment provides stronger support in advanced age, when flexibility is often reduced. So in a way, this decision is about choosing where you want your certainty: earlier flexibility or later stability. Neither is inherently better, but they serve different purposes. Now let's connect this back to something practical. When people ask, "What should I do?" what they're really asking is, "What risk am I willing to take?" Are you more concerned about not having enough later, or about not fully using what you have earlier? Are you more comfortable relying on your portfolio or on guaranteed income? Are you optimizing for maximum total dollars, or for how those dollars fit into your life? These questions don't have universal answers, but they shape the decision more than any single calculation. And here's the part most people miss. Even small adjustments in assumptions, just a few years of lifespan, a modest change in returns, a slight shift in spending, can move the needle significantly. Which means confidence in a single perfect answer is often misplaced. The goal isn't to find a flawless solution, it's to find a decision that remains reasonable across multiple possible outcomes. In other words, you're not trying to be exactly right, you're trying to avoid being significantly wrong.
Now let's move away from theory and look at how this actually plays out in real situations, because everything sounds balanced and nuanced until you're forced to make the decision, and that's when people default to simple rules. Delay as long as possible, start as early as you can. Both sound confident. Neither is universally correct. What matters is context. Let's walk through a few situations where starting earlier stops being a compromise and starts becoming a strategic move. Picture someone who just stepped into retirement. They've got a portfolio, maybe some savings, maybe not as much as they hoped. The market at that exact moment is unstable. Prices are down, volatility is high, headlines are negative. Now they need income. If they rely entirely on their investments, they're forced into a bad position. They have to sell assets when prices are low. That creates a problem that isn't obvious at first. Losses early in retirement don't just reduce your balance, they reduce your future potential, because the money you sell today isn't there to recover tomorrow. This is often called sequence risk, but you don't need the term to understand the impact. Bad timing early can echo for decades. Now imagine a different approach. Instead of pulling everything from investments, they turn on a steady income stream. Not because it's optimal on paper, but because it changes the situation. Now they can reduce withdrawals, maybe even stop them temporarily. Their portfolio gets time. Time to recover, time to compound, time to stabilize. That one decision, starting income earlier, can protect the rest of their financial structure. It's not about maximizing that one piece, it's about stabilizing the whole system. Now, flip the scenario. Same person, same market downturn, but this time they're not withdrawing heavily yet. They have cash, they have flexibility, and now that steady income becomes something else. It becomes opportunity. Instead of selling assets, they're buying them. While everyone else is pulling out, they're putting in. Not recklessly, not emotionally, but systematically. They're using stable income to take advantage of unstable conditions. That's a completely different position to be in, and it all comes down to timing. Now let's look at something more personal. Consider a household with two people. One has a strong earnings history. The other doesn't. This is more common than people realize. One partner worked full-time for decades. The other stepped back, maybe to raise a family, maybe for other responsibilities. When retirement arrives, their benefits aren't equal. One is substantial, the other is minimal. But here's the key detail. The lower earning partner may be eligible for benefits based on the higher earner, and those benefits don't always activate automatically. They depend on timing. If the higher earner delays too long, it can delay access to those benefits for the household, which means income that could have been coming in isn't. Not because it doesn't exist, but because the sequence is off. Now imagine that same household adjusting their approach. Instead of focusing only on maximizing one benefit, they look at the total picture. When does income start flowing? How much enters the household over time? How does one decision unlock another? Suddenly, the strategy shifts. It's no longer about one person maximizing their number. It's about coordinating both. And in some cases, starting earlier creates a better overall outcome. Not because the monthly amount is higher, but because the total flow of income across both people is more efficient. Now, let's take that one step further. Imagine the higher earning partner has serious health concerns. Not hypothetical concerns, real ones. This changes the equation in a way most simple models completely miss, because now the timeline is compressed. The focus shifts from maximizing over decades to optimizing over a shorter, uncertain window. In that situation, delaying can carry a hidden cost. If income is postponed too long, there may be fewer years to actually receive it. Meanwhile, starting earlier allows income to begin flowing while both people are still alive. And, depending on how benefits transition later, that early income can represent value that would otherwise never be realized. This is where strategy becomes less about maximizing a number and more about capturing value while it's available. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't show up in spreadsheets: behavior. Because even the best plan falls apart if it doesn't match how someone actually acts under pressure. Imagine someone who plans to delay. They've done the math, they know waiting increases their future income. But then something happens. Markets drop, expenses rise, uncertainty creeps in. Suddenly, that plan becomes harder to stick to. They hesitate, they second guess, they start making reactive decisions. Maybe they sell investments at the wrong time. Maybe they cut spending in ways that reduce their quality of life. Not because the plan was bad, but because it didn't account for human behavior. Now, compare that to someone with steady income already in place. They're not immune to stress, but they have a buffer. They don't have to make urgent decisions. They have time to think, and that changes how they act. Sometimes the best strategy isn't the one that looks perfect on paper. It's the one that people can actually follow. Now, let's bring in taxes, because this is where things quietly get complicated. Income doesn't exist in isolation. It interacts with other sources. It affects how much you keep. Early in retirement, many people experience a temporary dip in income. They're no longer working, but they haven't yet started mandatory withdrawals from retirement accounts. That creates a window, a period where total income is relatively low. During that time, certain types of income may be taxed more favorably. Later on, that can change. As required withdrawals begin, income rises, and with it, tax exposure. So the timing of when income starts can influence how much of it is actually usable. Starting earlier during lower income years can, in some cases, reduce the overall tax burden. It's not obvious, but over time, it adds up. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. All of these scenarios, market conditions, household coordination, health, behavior, taxes, they're not edge cases, they're common, and each one can tilt the decision in a different direction. That's why blanket advice struggles. It doesn't adapt. It assumes everyone is solving the same problem, but they're not. Some people need stability now, some need protection later, some need flexibility, some need simplicity. And the best choice depends on which of those matters most.
Instead of asking which option produces the maximum outcome under one scenario, ask a different question. Which option holds up reasonably well across multiple scenarios? That's a more useful way to think about it. Because you're not predicting the future, you're preparing for a range of possibilities. Now let's translate everything you've seen into a simple framework you can actually use. First, test your assumptions. Don't rely on a single estimate for how long you'll live. Adjust it. Move it forward. Move it backward. Watch how the outcome changes. If your decision flips completely with small adjustments, that tells you something important. It tells you the margin for error is thin. Second, look at your situation as a whole, not just one income stream, not just one number. Consider how different pieces interact: your savings, your spending, your partner's situation, your tax exposure. This isn't a single variable problem. Third, pay attention to timing, not just how much you receive, but when you receive it. Ask yourself, when will this income be most useful? When will it reduce the most pressure? When will it create the most flexibility? Because timing often matters more than totals. Fourth, be honest about behavior. Not ideal behavior, real behavior. How do you respond to uncertainty? How do you react when markets drop? How comfortable are you relying on investments versus guaranteed income? Your answers to those questions matter, because a strategy you can stick to is more valuable than one that only works in theory. Finally, recognize what this decision actually is. It's not a test. It's not something you pass or fail. It's a trade-off. You're choosing between different types of risk: the risk of not getting enough later, or the risk of not fully using what's available earlier, the risk of relying on markets, or the security of guaranteed income. There's no version of this decision without compromise, but there is a version that fits your situation better than the others, and that's the goal. Not perfection, not optimization, alignment.
Because in the end, this isn't just about maximizing numbers, it's about making sure the resources you've built over a lifetime actually support the life you want to live, at the right time, in the right way. And that decision deserves more than a one-size-fits-all answer.
Now let's bring all of this into one clear picture. Because at this point, you've seen the moving parts: timing, uncertainty, market conditions, health, taxes, behavior, coordination. Individually, each one makes sense. Together, they make the decision feel overwhelming. So instead of trying to simplify the decision, let's simplify the way you approach it. Imagine someone, we'll call her Anita. She's just entered retirement. She's in her early 60s, recently stepped away from work, and now she's facing the same question everyone eventually faces: start now or wait. Her numbers look solid on paper. If she starts immediately, she receives a modest but steady monthly income. If she waits a few years, that number grows. If she delays even longer, it grows more. At first, the decision feels like a trade-off between patience and reward. But then real life starts to fill in the blanks. Her expenses in the next few years are expected to be higher than later. She wants to travel, spend time with family, do things she postponed for decades. At the same time, her investment portfolio has just gone through a volatile period. It hasn't collapsed, but it's not at its peak either. So now the decision isn't abstract anymore. If she delays, she'll need to rely more heavily on her investments during a period of uncertainty. If she starts earlier, she reduces that pressure. Neither option is clearly superior, they just serve different purposes. Now let's add another layer: her spouse. He has a higher expected benefit, but also a more uncertain health outlook. That changes the timeline. Now the question isn't just about maximizing her own benefit, it's about how both benefits interact over time. If she waits, she increases her monthly amount, but she also delays income that could be coming into the household right now. If she starts earlier, she begins receiving income immediately, and depending on how things unfold, that early income could represent value that would otherwise never be realized. Again, not better or worse, just different trade-offs. Now let's walk through how small changes affect her decision. First, assume she lives well into her 80s. In that case, delaying begins to look more attractive. Higher monthly payments, larger adjustments over time, more total income. Now adjust that assumption slightly. Reduce her lifespan by a few years. Suddenly, the advantage of waiting shrinks. Reduce it further. Now the difference between starting early and waiting becomes minimal. In some cases, starting earlier may even come out ahead. This is the part most people underestimate. The outcome is highly sensitive to small changes, which means confidence in a single perfect answer can be misleading.